Welcome. We're very excited to welcome you to this webinar hosted by LPI Center for School and System Redesign. Our new center is generously funded by the Stewart Foundation, in part through their new Youth Thriving Community Fund. It's been wonderful to learn with our colleagues about the needs of the field, as well as bright spots in school transformation, and to design our 7-part webinar series with these cases in mind. The center builds on a decade of LPI's existing research and policy work around community schools and whole child education and the implementation of science of learning and development for school transformation. Also, the educator quality work informed by our network of partners that we've engaged through Ed Prep Lab. CSSR will convene technical assistant providers and other partners, host a repository with research tools and models for practitioners and educational leaders toward a goal of creating a national hub for school transformation, where we coordinate resources and opportunities for educators planning and implementing school, district, and statewide improvement initiatives. Our team will continue to identify policy opportunities at each level of the system and address existing policies that are in the way of school redesign. The idea of school as a public entitlement is in balance, and it has been for a few decades. It's continuously undermined by market-based solutions, which create greater inequity. The purpose and mission of schooling must be reframed in our current model because of the industrial error model that we've inherited. The future we are preparing for is unknown, and so we have to think about the ways in which we can create dispositions and habits of minds for learners in order to graduate learners who are empowered to take on current and future challenges and be prepared for jobs that do not yet exist. While the work to dislodge our current system may seem daunting, fortunately, we have strong evidence of what it takes to transform and sustain a model of schooling that successfully meets the needs of learners. Last spring, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, Matt Alexander, and Laura Hernandez authored a report, High School Redesign, 10 Features for Success. It outlines the practices and structures that lead to deep learning and personalization with students at the center. In the report and during each session, we will provide examples, tools, and strategies for how to develop meaningful developmental relationships, culturally sustaining pedagogy, and authentic curriculum assessment, as well as approaches to center students, families, and teachers in decision-making. This report is the framework for our series and a cornerstone of the center's work. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, President and CEO of LPI. Dr. Darling-Hammond is Emeritus Professor at Stanford University, where she taught for almost 20 years and founded the Center for Opportunity and Policy in Education. She began her career as a public school teacher, and she also founded a preschool as well as high school, East Palo Alto Academy, which we'll learn more about this afternoon. She's joined by Matt Alexander, school board president at San Francisco Unified School District. Matt Alexander has more than 20 years of experience as a teacher and principal in San Francisco. And in 2000, he worked with parents, youth, and educators in a multiracial movement for small community-based schools. Welcome, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. We are excited to be able to talk about the 10 features report that you described. It is full of examples from schools across the country, many of them in California, as well as the research base for what we may do in moving schools forward. So I'm going to share my screen now very quickly, if we can figure out how to make that happen. There it is. Let's hope that the technology gods are smiling on us today. There we go. And so we're going to just very quickly cover what the sort of the 10 features intend, and then have some time to talk with folks who have actually implemented them, and then of course have time for questions with all of you. We understand that this moment, as Cheryl said, is one where we need to really reinvent high school. And the reason is because our current schools were designed in the early 1900s, basically modeled on the assembly line that Henry Ford had just created for assembling cars. They were not designed to support relationships, which we now know to be so important, a whole child approach, the kind of 21st century deeper learning skills that are in demand now, the personalized supports that we want to be able to provide for all students to succeed, or for equitable opportunity or achievement. you can get a sense of how challenging it is for educators to make this old, obsolete system work for us, as hard as educators try, from this national survey that found of middle and high schoolers that less than 30% felt that their school provided a caring and encouraging environment. And most did not feel there is an adult who knows them well in school. This is not the fault of the adults who are trying hard. When I taught high school in factory model school settings, I had 150 to 180 students a day cycling past me in groups of 30, 5 or 6 times a day. And I worked very hard to know them and to support them. But the design of the institution was not designed to enable that to be highly effective. Recently, a Yale survey of 21,000 high school students found that 75% of their feelings about school were negative, and the most common ones were tired, stressed, and bored. And these outcomes are associated, again, not with the educators within the school, but with the design of the school itself. When the factory model was adopted, as I noted, it was actually designed around the efficient assembly line so that there would be a different teacher in each grade level, and then in middle and high school, a different teacher every 45 or 50 minutes to sort of stamp students with a lesson in a way that was modeled on the assembly line in industry. Teachers were viewed as individual workers, to plan and teach alone. There was no conception of the teacher as a professional or as the body of teachers as needing to work collectively together. Curriculum was actually designed and prescribed based on time and motion studies, and it was focused very much on rote transmission learning. I tell you, remember. Tracking was actually explicitly designed to create different conveyor belts for students by race and class, because eugenicists were very much involved in the early work of creating the, quote, modern school system. And schools were explicitly designed to select and sort rather than to develop talent. And there was the idea that students would drop out and fall away from elementary school all the way through as they could not keep up or manage to be there, and that was good. The ones who fell out the earliest would work in the factories and the farms, and then a few would stay further and they'd become a clerical class, and a few more would go on to college. And there was not then the idea that if students were struggling, there was something you should do to help them or design for that. In fact, it was encouraged that this selection and sorting process would occur. And so that leaves us with a number of problems today. It's hard for the structures that we inherited to allow us to know our students well, or for teachers to work together. Some of you may be in places where there is a little bit of collaboration time now, but that's been hard fought, and not nearly as much as in other countries, where on average the amount of time for collaboration among teachers is an additional 8 hours a week beyond what we have in the United States. We have large pupil loads at great classrooms. We have pacing guides that still assume that you can teach in a standardized fashion and that students will learn at the same pace in the same way. We have a focus often on narrow tests that really are not representative of the powerful, engaging learning we want for students. Often, to get compliance in this system, we have a lot of punitive rules. And then unequal treatment is baked in to the way the school is designed. So in sum, our schools are not designed to support adolescent thriving or democratic learning and participation. We need to be moving, of course, from schools that look like every child in their seat doing their own worksheets or bubbling in on their own practice tests, to schools where students are working collaboratively on inquiry, with support from their teachers in ways that allow them to master higher order thinking and problem solving skills. We also need schools based on what we know from the science of learning and development, in which we have learned that social, emotional, and academic development are completely tied to one another. We need places that engender much less cortisol production, the hormone that comes from anxiety and stress, and actually impedes the work of the brain, impedes neuron connections, impedes memory and attention and focus, and places that produce a lot more oxytocin, which I think of as the hugging hormone, which floods the brain and actually increases the communication among neurons. It allows us to become more intelligent as we get more brain wiring, as well as being more attentive. So we've kind of taken the foundation of the science of learning and development and the research that's been done over the last 30 or 40 years to identify these 10 features of successfully redesigned schools. And we're going to talk just a little bit about each one and how they come together in a whole school environment, and then talk to folks who have done that. And the first of these, the most fundamental, is positive developmental relationships, because we know that these relationships are what actually allows learning to occur. Learning occurs because of experiences and relationships. And when we design those to be productive, we get a lot more progress for students. As one student put it in one high school, he said, "School should not be mass production. It should be loving and close. This is what kids need. You need love to learn." And we need a place where kids can be known. What we found in the literature is that small learning communities, either small schools or small learning communities within bigger buildings of 300 to 500, promote those relationships not only with students, but also with families. Teaching teams that share the same students and have collaboration time to plan and problem solve around the students, as well as the curriculum, allow a more cohesive experience for students. And then very critically important are advisory systems that allow a meeting time, usually every day or most days of the week, where the advisor, who is a teacher or other professional adults in the school, can be an advocate for those 15 or 20 students, can be aligned to the families, can ensure that kids are well known, provide academic and social supports, and then time for social emotional learning and for restorative practices that allow kids to bond together, develop more community sensibilities and the skills to enact that. And that then is the foundation for all the other of the 10 features, the second of which is a safe, inclusive school climate. Of course, that it requires both explicit attention to building shared norms that the students have a stake in, and community in every classroom and throughout the school, in the lunchroom, in the playground, in whatever part of the school students experience. This is from one of the schools we studied. We've done case studies of many schools that have these features that were created by the students and then enforced by the students because they were their norms, and that are positively focused on being encouraging, motivational, not being selfish, not giving up, taking time to celebrate others, leaving no teammate behind. That then begins to create an environment in the school that discourages bullying, that discourages exclusionary behavior, that allows kids to feel membership and connection. Another way to create that climate is messages of affirmation and belonging, both in the materials that students encounter, the visual photos on the walls and the curriculum in their hands, and actions to counteract the stereotype threat that all of us feel if we hold identities that in the society are stigmatized. Kids will come into school expecting to be treated differently if they are stigmatized by race or class or immigration status or language background or disability status or sexual orientation. That that affirmation in this same school was actually a very explicit part of all of the classrooms. These are the affirmation bulletin boards that we saw in different classrooms that were really focused on ensuring that students are all getting that message in various ways. Restorative practices are a big piece of this as well. Community circles where students can share experiences, shared learning of conflict resolution, as well as social emotional skills by the adults, as well as the students. So in fact, there is a way to solve problems when they come up. And then opportunities when difficulties arise, to make amends, to contribute to the community that one has been part of. And we found in recent research that schools that adopt those kinds of practices, like conflict resolution, see improvements in virtually every area: mental health, less misbehaving, less gang membership, less victimization or bullying, but also students have stronger mental health, less depressive systems, substance abuse, fewer absences, higher grade point averages, and school climate goes up. So as schools increase these practices, you can see actual transformations in what goes on inside. The third feature is culturally responsive and sustaining teaching, and that comes from both cultural connections as well as inclusion and belonging and identity safety of the sort I was just describing. One of the things that's important to sort of understand as a foundation is that all of us have various cultural contexts. It's not that culture only belongs to some people and not to other students. All of our cultural contexts include the things we experience: our family, our friends, our neighborhood, our places of worship, our schools, those with shared interests, as well as language backgrounds and racial ethnic identities and other forms of experience, common experience that we share with others. And to address that, teachers need to have a lot of connections with students, need to know their students and what their experiences are, to connect those to the classroom. There's a lot to worry about today with respect to culturally supportive settings. In 2022, California principals reported 78% of them that students were making hostile or demeaning remarks towards LGBTQ classmates, 66% towards Black classmates, 50% towards Latinx classmates. But exclusion is also communicated not only from peer to peer, but by tracking systems that may be also racially and class coded, exclusionary curriculum where students do not feel represented, differential treatment, which is very common in disciplinary systems and produces highly differential outcomes in many places. Inclusion is fostered by learning from students, families, and communities. Matt will say more about that, and then building those connections between the curriculum and the school. I remember one school that during the pandemic organized a way for students to study what COVID was doing in their communities, both health-wise, sociologically, in terms of employment, in terms of family experiences of various kinds. And that became the basis of their projects across interdisciplinary subject areas, something that students obviously immediately care about because it has to do with them. The fourth area is that we need a curriculum that produces the opportunities for inquiry, for answering real questions, for deeper learning that produces the problem solving and the higher order thinking skills that are demanded in this economy and will be even more demanded as the economy rapidly shifts in the next 5 years. It's expected that about a third of our current jobs will disappear entirely or be dramatically transformed. And the people who will be able to succeed will be those who are adaptable, who know how to learn. As one student put it in a deeper learning school, the engagement with models, research exhibitions, projects, coming up with your own topics and problems, creating the questions and answering them, writing essays, engaging in visuals, that kind of engaging, deeper learning produces students we know from the research who not only do more work that is higher order thinking in high school, but they do better in college as well. And then finally, student-centered pedagogy, which means learning from students as well as being ready to teach them, learning how they learn, designing collaboration very thoughtfully and teaching it, thoughtful scaffolds, varieties of ways that principals also need to help us find time in schools for lab classes, for mentoring and tutoring, resource rooms, and universal designs for learning that have multiple forms of engagement, representation, and action and expression. I'm going to pass the ball to Matt for the next 5 features.
Thanks, Linda. So yeah, and if we're going to change our curriculum and our pedagogy in the ways that Linda just described, we also need to change our assessment systems, right? As educators, you all, I'm sure, are familiar with the annual drop of the state test data. And we spend a lot of time often in schools looking at data, but it's often not actionable. It often isn't embedded in the student experience. And so good secondary schools rethink assessment first by saying, what really do we want students to know and be able to do by the time they graduate, and have really clear expectations and meaningful expectations about that. Um, and then create systems that center student work and specific examples of student work that demonstrate progress toward those standards and those expectations. These systems usually include portfolios of student work that are judged based on rubrics that are used throughout the school, as well as oral presentations or exhibitions, defense committees, other ways for students to present and defend their work. And then the last one there, opportunities for revision, which is really critically important, that it's not just the teach, test, and hope for the best methodology, but instead actually in classes, there's opportunities for students to revise their work, make it better, and then include it as examples of quality work in these what are often called portfolio systems. If we can go to the next slide, there's actually a photo there. Okay, so this is an actual, the quote there is from Fannie Lou Hamer Freedom High School in New York City, which was a school that the school I worked at, June Jordan's School for Equity in San Francisco, was modeled off of. We actually went to visit Fannie Lou Hamer and some other of the New York small schools in the early 2000s and modeled June Jordan off of that. But the photo is from June Jordan School for Equity, and it's one of our students participating in her senior portfolio defense, where she was presenting her work from her 4 years. There's some teachers there. I believe that's another student. There's often parents and family members at these committees, and they ask, the student presents their work, examples of their work, written examples, and then an oral presentation. And then they ask questions. And then the second part of the committee actually is focused on their post-secondary plan. So it's a way of assessing the student's work, but it's also an opportunity for the student to begin to think with their peers in the school community, their teachers, and their family around their post-secondary plans. So a lot of secondary schools now do these kind of exhibition type graduations. There's other ways, capstone projects, there's other ways of doing, I'm sure folks on this call are familiar with. So and obviously a very critical component of all of this work is the teachers, right? As was mentioned in the introduction, am now president of the school board in San Francisco, where we have a great teacher shortage. And so when we talk about any kind of plans trying to improve the district, it's virtually impossible to think about it without a strong and stable teaching force. And if we have lots of teacher turnover, you can have the best curriculum, the best programs, and none of it's going to actually get implemented because teachers are not there, they're not well prepared, and they're not learning along the way. So the research shows that that's a huge determinant of student success. One of the greatest determinants of student success is teacher quality, and that involves both preparation. And listed on the slide there are the 3 key areas that teachers need to be prepared in: subject matter and curriculum, the needs of diverse learners and learning process, and teaching itself, or the sort of pedagogical methods of how to be flexible and meet the needs of diverse learners in the classroom in action. And then the second piece is ongoing learning and collaboration. Teachers need to be constantly learning and working together. And there's lots of strategies for this. Peer observation, lesson study is an incredible one, networks across schools. But on the next slide is an example of something we did at June Jordan School for Equity, just as an example of this, where we noticed that there was a lot of good teaching practices happening in the school, but they weren't consistent, and we weren't having consistent conversation about it. So over the course of several years, teachers began doing peer observations, and we asked the question, what is working? What are you seeing that's working in your colleagues' classrooms? And you'll see on the screen there some of the examples of very specific practices that teachers observed in one another's classes. And then we categorize them into these 6 categories. Warm demander students as intellectuals, knowledge of students. So and we gave them these names that were, so often drawn from the research. Like warm demander is a concept that there's lots of academic research on, but we actually named the specific practices and then gave it a name that we could use as common language. Oh, are you being a warm demander with your students? Oh, here's a time when I wasn't the warm. I was too much of a, I was too harsh in that critique of that student. I need to be warmer in my approach. So we had a level of common language that we could use. It was focused on best practices. Teachers are so self-critical all the time anyway. We were always looking for the best examples and saying, you may have had a bad lesson yesterday, but when was the time that you did it well, and how can we do that more often? And we created an open door policy in the school so that educators were constantly observing one another. Students would observe teachers and give them feedback. Parents would come and visit and observe teachers. And they would all use this same framework in the same language so that we could be talking about teaching practice together. And it really created a space for educators to learn and grow together. The next feature is authentic family engagement. I mentioned parents coming in and observing classrooms and using that rubric. That was a strategy we used at June Jordan in order to ensure that there's authentic family engagement. There's research showing that authentic family partnerships increase attendance, they increase students' sense of safety in school, and they increase student achievement. Often at high schools, we sort of put this on the back burner and we say, well, it doesn't matter anymore. And often the teenagers don't really want parents at school anyway. So everyone's sort of on the same page that we don't want to talk to parents. Well, that's a really bad idea because it actually is critically important, including at high school. And you can do home visits, student family conferences. Those are things that we did at June Jordan. They do require structures for personalization because, as Linda said, I also taught in a traditional high school where I had 150 students, or 180 actually almost. There was no way that I could talk to all of those parents. But if I were an advisor to 20 students, then it's feasible to do conferences for those students if there's time built into the schedule for that. The focus has to be on building authentic relationships, trusting parents' expertise, having positive communications, not just calling parents when there's a problem. And it's really important, obviously, to be able to communicate with parents in their language. This is a group, the picture is actually a group of Spanish-speaking parents I was meeting with a couple of weeks ago about their experiences. And it was really interesting to hear them. They're all San Francisco public school parents. And they were talking about how they really wanted better communication from teachers. They wanted teachers who could help support their kids, especially kids with IEPs. And so they essentially wanted the same thing that the teachers wanted and from the system as a whole, but they weren't in communication with teachers. And so, being able to bridge that language gap is really, really important. Over 40% of California families speak a language other than English at home. So that's number 8. Number 9 is community connections and integrated student supports. This picture is actually a video that we don't have time to show, but it's from Oakland International High School. They have this incredible practice called community walks where they go and they actually have students lead tours of the community for students and their parents, and other community members coordinate tours of the community for the staff of the school so that the staff have a deep knowledge of the community. You'll see, and if we go to the next one, there's a lot of talk these days, and I'm sure those of you on the call have heard of this, and there's now a major investment, thanks to Linda's leadership and the governor's leadership and others, in community schools that allows schools to really connect with the community, to use that knowledge to bring into the school the things that students and families need to succeed. On the screen, you'll see an example of Mendez High School, where and all the different services that they bring into their school, from health and wellness to arts and enrichment to academic support and case management, leadership development. And these are all examples of the community schools model and how those wraparound services can really support the core academics. And again, these are all practices that have been found in research to increase academic achievement. The next slide is just a specific example. This is a family that I'm actually friendly with now and know pretty well. They're an immigrant family from El Salvador asking for asylum. They spent 9 months sleeping on the floor of a school gym in San Francisco because the school has actually opened its gym to become a homeless shelter. And this is just an example of how the school saw that the city wasn't actually meeting the needs of newly arrived asylum-seeking families. And so they agreed to offer the school space as a shelter. It's not the most ideal setting, and they were actually very happy to move out of the shelter and into a subsidized apartment. But for that time, it was a lifesaver for them, really. And so this is a New York Times story about the family, but it was this is just an example of how the school can really be the center of a community and meet families' needs in a very direct way. And they'll be forever grateful for that school, and had just a whole different level of connection with their kids and their kids' education, knowing that the school had literally provided them a place to live for 9 months. And finally, shared decision-making and leadership, feature 10. The community organizer, Marshall Gant, says that leadership is accepting responsibility to create conditions that enable others to achieve shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. The key words there are enabling others to achieve shared purpose. Sometimes school principals think their job is to tell everyone what to do. That's not the case. Their job is actually to enable others to achieve shared purpose. And it's really, really important that school leaders have that kind of a frame around leadership, that they help facilitate shared norms and values in school communities, and that they put decision-making authority as close as possible to the classroom. Again, these are research-based practices, and we have in our publication lots of specific examples of how to do that. And now you will get to actually hear more about that.
Well, I want to just note that Matt has talked about a number of things that are difficult to do in traditional model schools, like teacher collaboration time and advisory structures. In the 10 features and in what follows in this conversation and in the ones subsequent, we do give examples and models of how you can find the time, organize the schedule, get the resources aligned. And two people who've done that are about to talk to us next. First is Nikki Ramos-Beeben. Nikki began her career as a high school English teacher in a traditional school and was the founding principal of the East Palo Alto High School, which in 2001, which I was delighted to have the privilege to work with her in. And in partnership with Stanford University, Nikki led that school, which in a very short period of time moved from having high dropout rates for the students in that community to very high graduation rates. She spent her whole career, 30 years in education, advocating for building and leading small public schools and teaching beginning teachers how to create inclusive, productive, and safe learning communities. So welcome, Nikki. And with her is Jeff Gilbert, who has been the lead principal at Hillsdale High School for 20 years, after spending 4 years as a founding educator at East Palo Alto Academy. And he was a graduate of the Stanford Teacher Education Program. He helped lead Hillsdale's small learning community redesign work, and we'll hear more about that in just a moment. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see Jeff and Nikki. Maybe we could take that down so we'll have a bigger, a better look at our panelists. So Nikki, I want to start with you. You did teach for many years at a traditional high school, and you were asked to consider becoming that founding principal, and then really were instrumental in designing the school. We did look at designs that have been successful in New York City and in other places at that time. East Palo Alto had been without a high school for many years, since 1976. They lost their high school during desegregation at a time when at that point the high school was nearly all Black, and that was the community setting. At the time the school was started, we were asked to start it by a elementary superintendent who said, we want to bring a school back to our community. About 2/3 of the kids who were being bused out to other communities were dropping out. And within a short period of time, after the first 4 years and ever since then, the school's been graduating about 90% of its students every year and sending about 90% to college. And I wanted you to think about what were the most important features of the new school you were able to launch that allowed it to achieve dramatically different results for its students.
All right, thank you, Linda. Cheryl, can you put the PowerPoint up? All right, so I brought 6 factors, Linda, in answer to your question, because I believe in starting where we can all start. And so these are school structures I'm going to talk to you about in only 5 minutes that we used at EPA, but that I think are tangible structures you can implement and use to redesign your school from where you are right now. You can start anywhere. These structures are all adaptive. They, in some sense, are one size fit all, and in another sense, they're completely adaptable to your school. And you can implement them to the extent that you can implement them. Wherever you feel that there's already sort of a current running in your school of conversations that's happening, I would suggest that you leverage that to get some change. and just do them right if you do them right, because we know that things fail in implementation. So let's get started. 6 factors. The first is student cohorts. Now, this basically means that you group students into cohorts by grade level, right? This is the Hillsdale model that Jeff's going to talk about in a minute that we did at EPA, but that any school can do. Basically means that say you had 90 to 120 students in your freshman class, that you would group them together into 3 to 4 cohorts of 30 to 40 students who would take their classes together. They take math, ELA, science, and history together. And what does that mean? That means that the teachers who teach them are now able to talk about the same group of students, right? So if teachers can talk about students, they can align their learning objectives, they can coordinate their major assessments, they can organize their summative projects to reduce student stress so not everything hits at once. They can talk about student needs, and they can come to agreement about how to meet those needs. There's so much efficiency of school service that comes out of just doing this one little thing, grouping students into cohorts by grade level. And then if you could keep the students with their cohort for multiple years, you maximize the benefits. This is looping. And I believe Mr. Mitchell asked a question about this in the chat. Looping just means that if I'm a teacher, I get to teach you for multiple years. So if I'm a freshman English teacher, I stay with my students through sophomore year. What that means is, by the end of the year, when I really know my students, now I have them the next year, and I can really leverage my knowledge of these students to teach them even better. It also reduces tracking to have multi-year looping, because what you're saying is we're going to work to make the same curriculum available to all students at the same time. So at East Palo Alto Academy, all of our freshmen started in algebra, and we supported them through cohorts, through looping. And then the other thing we did at our school was consensus decision making. I know Linda talked about shared decision making. We took it one step further and we said, look, teachers are going to make the school-wide decisions that affect them at this school. And I know that's not necessarily possible for all schools to implement consensus decision making tomorrow, but you can certainly start within your department to have the conversation about how can we, as teachers, make decisions for things that we can control. Consensus decision making really forces everyone to come to agreement about the important policies, structures, and practices at their school, within, of course, the parameters set by education law and by your school board. But really, teachers who make decisions for their school are happier teachers. They're more empowered, and you're also creating a small learning community for teachers when you allow teachers to have a real stake and say in what happens at their school. It also focuses all the conversation on the needs of the students. People often ask me, well, don't you have teachers sabotaging your consensus decision making? I've never seen that happen. If you're having real, honest discussion where everyone is heard, and not just heard, but engaged with, then in the end, you have teachers who buy into the decision because they were a part of it. So in terms of starting small learning communities at your school, you can start with any one of these 3 factors. You can also start on the next slide with these 3 approaches to teaching and learning. So these are 3 other things we did at EPA and that we learned. We didn't just do these in a vacuum, right? We learned them from schools in New York. We visited Gateway, Matt's school. We learned from them as well. One of the things that a lot of schools that really work for kids have in common is they take the time to develop habits of mind. What's that? It's that the school identifies what they want students to be able to know and do by the end of 4 years, what kinds of people they want them to be, what kinds of learners they want them to be. These are all teachable and accessible, and they must be worth teaching and assessing. So for example, at East Palo Alto High School, our habits were personal responsibility, right? Turning your work on time, showing up to school, doing what you say you're going to do. Social responsibility, right? Working well with your peers, engaging in a conflict resolution when things don't go well. Communication, how well could you read? How well could you speak? How well could you communicate your point of view? Creativity, right? How well could you express your own creativity when it comes to the subject matter? And then the last one was subject matter knowledge, right? How well do you know Algebra 1 standards? How well do you know biology? Those were our habits of mind. All the students were graded on all those habits in all their classes. We developed a school-wide rubric that showed students exactly what it meant to master those habits. And we didn't give grades. We only gave comments on the rubric. What the students told us was that was extremely helpful for them as students, especially going into college. And the other thing they said was very helpful were our exhibitions. Every year, the students had to sit for a live exhibition where they history in an authentic way of a core subject. These were multi-step, complex, authentic assessments that asked students to demonstrate core skills and knowledge. For example, freshmen at East Palo Alto Academy wrote a series of personal narratives to showcase their nonfiction writing skills. Sophomores built scale models of structures like the Golden Gate Bridge or a guillotine or a soccer field. And the seniors all presented a portfolio that showcased evidence of their mastery of our habits of mind. The exhibitions were presented in front of a panel of community members and teachers and their peers. And the students were all evaluated on our school-wide rubric, and they repeated it until they passed. And students told us that the exhibitions, which they were not all fans of when they first started, that plus the habits of mind, plus advisory was what got them through high school and into college. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is advisory. If I could wave a wand, a magic wand over all schools, I would require that every school has an advisory program, a real advisory program, not a homeroom, not a tutorial, but a real program that pairs one adult with a small group of students for 2 to 4 years. The adult's job is to support the social, emotional, and academic needs of all their advisees, to be the main point of contact for the advisees' families, to get to know each student and their personal story. And this is 1/5 of a teacher's job. This is one class every day that the students come to where they get support on their homework. They get to check in with an adult about what's going on at school. They have a dedicated place for restorative practices like conflict resolution. They have a dedicated place to get the academic counseling that they need over the 4 years. And advisory, in my opinion, is the there are probably more than one way, but I think this is a tried and true way to say convincingly that no child, no adolescent is falling through the cracks at our school because we have a strong advisory program. And I tell all the new teachers who I teach that if you could work at a school with an advisory, that would be a school where I would work. We saw our advisees last month at a reunion, and these are kids who are not kids. These are adults in their late 30s. And one of the comments they made, which stuck with me, was they said that you all loved us too much as advisors. And I was like, that is not possible for us to love you too much. Their point was, that's not what the real world is like. And our point was, that's exactly how it should be like. So I think everyone should have an advisory. And if you could make that happen at your school, and if you want to know how to make that happen, we're doing a four webinar series on advisories in January. Linda and myself and Matt and Jeff are doing a 4-part series on the budgeting and staffing that it takes to make that happen, not just advisory, but other changes to implement these 10 features. So that's all I want to say about what the 6 features that really helped us to get closer to those 10 features. I'll pass it back to you, Linda.
Thank you. And I want to let Jeff build on what you've talked about. Jeff also taught in a large traditionally organized high school and then came to East Palo Alto and helped us start it, and then returned to that same high school and redesigned it with the faculty in a very substantial way in the San Mateo High School District. And it ended up becoming in a district of schools of choice, one of the most popular choices. It had not been that previously, with growing enrollment and climbing up the list of best schools in the nation in the U.S. News and World Report, even while doing away with most tracking and redesigning all of these features. So I want to pass the ball to you, Jeff, to talk a little bit about what you found was most important in getting these changed outcomes.
Linda, thank you. For me, it was invaluable to be a part of the small school in East Palo Alto because it allowed me to see what it looked like to make sure that all students were known well and that teachers were empowered I ended up coming back to Hillsdale, as you said, which is a comprehensive public high school. I knew my own children were going to go to Hillsdale. I had the opportunity to come back here. And Hillsdale is, again, public school, 20 miles south of San Francisco. We have about 1,500 students. About 40% of our students are Latino, about 30% white, about 15% Asian. We have dozens of languages on campus, a very diverse school and a very diverse community. And we are a small learning community school. We do have advisory, we loop with our students, and we really do put a focus on the 10 features. We began this journey about 25 years ago. I was still a teacher here at the school, and we began conversations knowing that the structures and systems that we had in place at Hillsdale, the comprehensive systems, were not working for our students. And so we invested a lot of time into looking into models that could be more effective. And I think one of the best decisions we made as a school was, before we talked about what we wanted to do, we spent a lot of time on why we wanted to do it and what was our purpose or our goals. And you could see that on the screen, that what we came up with were what we call our cornerstone values. And for me now as a leader, my work is largely to hold a lens to those values and make sure that we attend to them in our resource allocation at every turn. We are flexible about how we get to those values, because sometimes the outside world changes. Sometimes things happen internally, but we really do try to focus on achieving those cornerstone values. And as Nikki noted, it's not about me as a leader. It's about developing a culture so that the teachers in our community own these values and to make the decisions that lead toward the fulfillment of them. We, at the beginning of this journey, we really believed that we didn't know our students well enough. That, as Linda said, you'd have 150, 160 students. They would come and go. You'd have them for a semester. We didn't know our students. We didn't have relationships that were deep and meaningful. And we had a vision of teaching that we just couldn't do in a comprehensive school with students taking classes from 7 different teachers who never got to talk to each other. And so in our research and over time, we were able to implement a smaller learning community model. We can show you the pieces of that on the next slide. And I would say that one of the things I carried from my time at the small school in East Palo Alto, and then coming back to a large public school, was that structures and systems matter. If we don't change the structures and systems in large schools, then we default to asking teachers who are already overworked just to do more and to do it better. And I think that can often lead to cynicism and just burnout. And so we have to make the conditions for teachers more realistic so they can do the work that they know they want to do, so that the gap between their vision of what they want and the reality of their day is closer. And so this is just a simple look at our model. This is in our 9th and 10th grade. One of the words that Linda talks about all the time is coherence. We try to create a coherent small school model within the public school. And so we went from our cornerstones to our structures. And this slide describes what we do. We'll have about 345 students in our standard program. We'll divide them into 3 cohorts. Our counselors do that during the summer. They balance those cohorts of students. We look at all sorts of different criteria to make sure that they are 3 equal small schools. Our schools are named after cities of art and culture. So our 3 9th grade schools are Florence, Kyoto, and Oaxaca. We have a small learning community for our newcomers called Manila, and then we also have 3 small learning communities in our 11th and 12th grade, which we call our upper division. And so in our 9th and 10th grade, which is the most coherent part of our model, we again have about 115 students there. We have chosen not to have distinguishing characteristics between the small learning communities. So they are just 3 small schools. Each small school, each SLC has 4 core teachers. So an English, social studies, math, and science teacher. And for each of those 4 teachers, their entire assignment is to teach those 115 students. Those students then loop and stay with those teachers for 2 years, except for in science, where a biology teacher hands the students off to a chemistry teacher. So now you've shrunk the caseload for our teachers in the 9th and 10th grade to about 115 families that they then get to know over the course of 2 years with looping. All students in 9th grade are in heterogeneous classes: heterogeneous English, social studies, biology, PE, and now in geometry. We have about 90% of our students take geometry in their first year of math in heterogeneous settings. We do have a small number who go right to Algebra 2, but the vast majority take geometry together so that we can support their choice of math classes after that. Begin advisory is the center of this work. Every teacher who's in a core house is also the advisor for a quarter of those students. So if you're the English teacher in Florence House, you'd see those students twice a day. You see them in advisory, and then you see them in English. Classes are set next to each other. So the English classroom is next to the social studies classroom, is next to the math classroom. And we have embedded in our master schedule opportunities for those teachers to work together every day. So all of the advisors in a house have second period off. Florence House, which I work with, has second period off. We meet during that time to talk about students and talk about advisory curriculum. Ed specialist meets with the team. The counselor meets with the team to take notes and then design support systems for the students during that kid talk period. Content teams also have a designated release time together. So the 3 biology teachers, for example, in all of the different houses get to meet together to design curriculum. So the goal is to create a base in the 9th and 10th grade that allows all students to flourish, to be on track, to go to a 4-year college if that is their choice, and to get to know at least one adult really well. And our school ends up having sort of this hybrid identity. You're a Florence student, you're also a Hillsdale High School student. So we do have a 9th and 10th grade core, and then as students graduate out of that, they move into an 11th and 12th grade core, which has an advisory system that has a much more of a focus on post-high school planning and supports. It's a little looser. We do have AP classes in 11th and 12th grade. And some of those design principles are ones you can learn about if you choose to be part of the 4-session conversation about school redesign that Matt and I will lead starting in January. So those are the pieces of the 10 features that we've set up to ensure that all students are known well and to give our teachers a chance to design the curriculum that they want to.
Great. And I want to give our, there's a lot of questions in the chat. We're going to be collecting those. I want to give folks a chance to sort of process all of this. So we're going to go into small groups of about 4 each, where you can talk about what features resonate for you, what would you like to see happening in your school, or if you've already done some of these, what have you experienced and learned by doing it, and what questions do you have? And we'll come back at about 5:15 for questions. So actually, let's make it about 5:10 to spend about 15 minutes in the groups. Come back at 5:10, they'll have a chance to take up all the questions that people have or comments that you'd like to make. I'm thrilled that in the chat, we've got a lot of people doing much of this work already, sharing their experiences with others in the chat. So we want to encourage that as well. And I'm going to turn the magic wand over to, I think, Nicole to get us into our groups.
So Nicole's working on adding you to a group, and so we'll have folks with a facilitator notes. So please feel free to review those notes with the questions that Linda just shared. And there's also, hopefully you have a note taker. So there's a grid that will drop that you can just collect your ideas and notes from that conversation. And we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes.
Dive into it. You know, advisory is essentially, if done well, it's an additional prep for teachers. You know, I don't know, Jeff, that's kind of how you treat it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, Hillsdale, that was one of the biggest decisions we made, was to treat it as a separate, as a part of it's a fifth of your assignment. And so then you get planning time that goes along with it. There are a lot of issues, you know, we can talk about how you create a schedule that allows teachers to plan for advisory in an effective way. I think a lot of the failures come from you walk in and you're by yourself. And for me, the power of creating teams of really 4 or 5 at the most people who plan together, who have time to plan together, so you're not alone. I think it would be really hard to do an advisory if you were just planning it and not being able to bounce ideas and plan together with other people. So it's that cohort and it's time built in to figure out what works, and then doing it slowly and phasing it in.
And then there are resources that many people use for advisory. There's something called the advisory guide. These are all listed in the 10 features book. So if you go in there, you'll see a list of resources. There's another one called conflict resolution in the high school. It gives activities, it gives lesson plans for activities that you can do with students, to have them share their feelings about different things, to work together on problem solving for various purposes. At East Palo Alto High School, we did advisory twice a day because the kids had high levels of need. It was a community with a lot of drive-by shootings at one moment in time. It's less the case now, and other challenges, and kids could come in quite traumatized. So the first thing in the morning, advisory was breakfast, talking about what was going on, checking in. If a kid had a need, they could then be immediately referred to the supportive resource in the school, and then doing social emotional learning work, some mindfulness work, a variety of things like that. And then, as Jeff said, in the 11th and 12th grade, really the fact that you've only got one counselor in most schools for 500 kids means that there's not enough college counseling. So the advisors can become distributed counselors, and the counselors can work with the advisors to have kids doing things around college exploration, around getting ready for doing their applications, the FAFSA. All that can happen in advisory, and with guidance from the counseling staff. So being structured and organized about it, having resources for people and guidance and materials, is also part of making it meaningful. Cheryl, I looked through the SharePoint. There was not much in the grid. Are there other questions that folks have?
Sure, happy to share one out.
Mhm.
One of the participants asked if you could speak to how this design process at a school works, if you think about engaging community experts in intentional and respectful ways, and how that informs pedagogy at the school site.
I think that was asked about East Palo Alto, and Nikki put in the name of the book that was written by the teachers to explain how they did it. So that's one resource for starting a small school within a school, or a school it's called Be the Change. But we're also currently, for example, working with Anaheim Union High School District, where they need to merge 2 schools because of declining enrollment. Many districts are going to be in that situation, and they are working to redesign what would be otherwise a very big factory model school into small learning communities and so on. And one of the things they're doing is talking to Jeff and to Nikki and to others to Cheryl, who are experienced in this work. And as they create their faculty planning group and bring in parents and so on, having the opportunity to have experts who've done this before and who can reach to the research base as well. And then doing site visits to schools that have done this work. And I'll let Cheryl and others speak to strategies that people can use.
To Matt or Jeff,
Cheryl?
want to begin?
Yeah, I think that the one point I would make from what I heard in the question is there's a lot in that question. In how you begin this process, I do think that the school itself has to be, and I mentioned this before, you have to be really clear on why you're doing this. And Hillsdale has been doing this for a long time. We have a lot of visitors. And you can tell pretty quickly the schools that are well set up to be successful, and those that are coming in because they heard this was a good idea and somebody has it as it's on their list of to-dos, or it's coming from top down. If the staff is not invested in, can talk about this perhaps in our other sessions, how you cultivate that, how you get buy-in, And that does take some time to really set aside time as a staff to have conversations about, like, what are you trying to do and why are you trying to get to a certain spot? And then the structures are there to answer the need rather than throwing those structures out without understanding why you're doing. I think that's why advisory doesn't succeed sometimes, is there's not clarity around why it exists.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this happens in a variety of ways, right? Small schools that are starting from scratch, large schools that are kind of breaking into small learning communities, and each of those are very different in terms of what the process is. But I think to the point is having a clear sense of vision and purpose, spending a lot of time making sure everybody is on board and developing the trust that this shared decision-making process is real and that the folks who are closest to the needs of the learners are having an input in terms of how this redesign process can really shift the teaching and learning context and how students engage in schooling.
And
So,
really, just
go
to
ahead.
add to that, it really important is to have parents involved in the planning group so that they're also learning the same things, going on the same site visits, engaging in the conversation, and thinking with the faculty, so that when you get to the place where you're starting to increase the size of the number of people involved, there are folks from various perspectives who are able to contribute to the conversation in a meaningful way.
And another question that came up is, what are some effective outreach strategies that bring parents in who may not feel comfortable participating and who may have challenges or struggles to be engaged in the process? So I'll throw that back out to folks.
I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, I think we put a big emphasis on this at June Jordan School. And there definitely were a lot of parents who had bad school experiences themselves, specifically with our school districts, right? And who didn't want to be involved. And there were many parents who had busy work schedules, working multiple jobs because the rent is so high in San Francisco. Again, I mean, it's back to the point that you all were just making around the why. We said this is really critically important, that parents and educators are on the same page around educating our kids and raising our kids together. So if it's a priority, then the question was, how are we going to figure it out? And it's about relationships. It's back to that core point. So how do you build relationships? So first we had the structure. So we had advisory. So that each advisor was responsible for making contact with parents of their advisees. We had, for a number of years, we had grants that allowed us to do home visits and teachers to get paid to do home visits before the school year started. But even when we didn't, advisors could call, make that connection. And frankly, I've never met a parent that didn't want their kid to succeed in school. I mean, every parent, no matter how busy they are, if they feel like the teacher really wants to talk with them and really wants to connect, they're going to be open and willing to connect. I've just never in my career experienced that not to be the case. And so I think some of this is just reframing what's a priority, right? And how are we really approaching parents? And again, it's not to say that there weren't people that just struggled to come through, but everyone eventually would connect in some way or another if we were flexible, if we were persistent, and if we were clear that we were doing it because we trusted parents as the first experts on their kids, right? I mean, that would be a lot of the conversation would be like, look, you know your kid much better than I do. So let's help me understand how to best educate them. And parents really, really appreciated that and wanted to be involved in it.
Yeah. And that one-on-one is so important. There's a lot of great questions now, and we've got only a few minutes. I do want to take this question that I think is often a tough one that Rachel Ledwidge has put in the chat for you, Jeff. I'm wondering at Hillsdale how you can place students without tracking in those cohorts so that all kids had an equitable math experience while being taught high school math. David mentioned an integrated course without labels. So Jeff, can you speak to that?
Yeah, it took us a while to get to the point where we felt confident in heterogeneous grouping in the 9th and 10th grade. And so it did happen with social studies and English first, and then we went to science, and then the 9th grade math was the last piece of that. And so the grouping it's nothing more complicated than literally sitting down and sorting the students and looking at characteristics like students with IEPs, students who have certain backgrounds in math or whatever, And I think that what it's done for us is that geometry in particular we found that to be accessible for a lot of students in a way that algebra um, wasn't. And so we decided to go with geometry, partly because most students didn't have experience in that. And so it really brought them to the table in the classroom with a kind of a level playing field. And it allowed our teachers then to assess where the students were at and then backfill and support them around algebra and other concepts that they needed, which then allowed us to guide them because we loop, then the teachers were invested in determining what the right pathway was for them. So in sophomore year, they do then begin going into tracked classes. Some students go into algebra, some into algebra 2, and then from there into the more advanced classes. And that forced our teaching team to, I mean, they spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of time in the summer planning that curriculum to make sure that it was accessible, that it was differentiated in a way to allow all students to be successful. And 2 years in, there's no question we're happy with it, and we have by and large not had those students saying like this isn't, this is too slow for me. But it took a lot of work and time to design that model.
Yeah. I am glad that some people are answering each other in the chat because we're really out of time for questions now. And I want to pass the ball back to Cheryl to close us out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Linda, and to Matt and Jeff for joining us, and to Nikki, who had to move on to teaching. We're grateful for our panelists, but also for all of you for spending time with us today. We hope you've left with something that will both inform and inspire your work. And we invite you to join us for our next webinar session, which is December 12th, and it's focused on relationship-centered approaches that matter. In that session, we'll have Laura Hernandez, who was an author of the 10 Features Report, and she'll be joined by experts who talk about advisory structures, restorative practices, teaching teams, and other strategies to build community and a sense of belonging in schools. We've talked a bunch about our mini series that are coming up, and so I want to invite you to join us also for those series. We've thought about inviting folks in teams, maybe with teachers or district folks from your setting, and those will be capped at like 30 people because we're intending to create smaller learning communities, and we will ask that you participate for all 4 sessions. They're an hour-and-a-half sessions from 4 to 5:30. But I wanted to just name why we started with these 3 areas. We've talked about the ways in which we've sometimes engaged in kind of creating advisories or trying to do culturally relevant work, and that may not happen in a deep way. And so people kind of leave it and think it's in place. But we know it takes a lot of expertise, a lot of time, a lot of strategic thinking. And so that's what our experts will guide you through, some of that work. And so here, the dates are there. Jeff and Matt will be doing the budgeting, staffing, and scheduling. Linda and Nikki will be doing advisory models, and I will be joined by Chela Delgado doing culturally relevant pedagogy and practices. So hope to see you in one of our webinar series or in our next session. Thank you for joining us this evening.